Welcome to Circular Strategies Podcast, where we have conversations with leaders engaged in the circular economy, those driving the change, the innovation, and most importantly, the impact. Today, we are fortunate to have just such a guest. Andy Weinstein is CEO of GODOT. Andy is a visionary, a thought leader, strategically minded, operational focused executive with many years of supply chain operations, sales, and marketing experience in the food and beverage supply distribution industries. We are excited to have Andy here and to talk about his current initiative and the significance of this innovation. Well, welcome, Andy. It is really a pleasure to have you here today. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey into the circular economy?
My journey to the circular economy starts actually in what we do as a family business. As a third generation Pepsi bottler, I know I essentially produce sugar water in plastic containers and metal containers, right? I deliver it day in and day out to all of these accounts across the world. And at some point, as a young kid, I realized that I would have to address the externalities caused by distributing plastic and metal across the globe. It's fundamentally a part of our value, it's what we do to deliver product, but it's also our footprint. And so I've always thought about, how do I bring things back? How do I leverage our relationships, our dynamics, our infrastructure to collect these waste streams and extract value? So from a circular economy perspective, it's been baked in. And I really think back to kind of the original days when my grandfather started Weinstein Beverage. Every bottle was glass. The cost of the container was enough to merit the systematic return of it, right? So when you think back in those days, in like 1937, with all these Pepsi trucks going out, is they actually had a beautiful circular supply chain, right? The products went out, the container came back, they refilled it, or they cleaned it, refilled it, and then put it back out. And that then enabled the container to have multiple uses and really be this circular economy. Today, I've kind of just done that I'm doing that on steroids, right? I'm looking at, how do I take apple waste, right? What my grandfather originally started was selling apples, and then had the opportunity to sell Pepsi. Now I'm taking the apple waste and I'm converting that into things like food grade CO2, so that becomes the carbonation of your local Pepsi. So in Wenatchee, in a 5 years time, when you have a Pepsi, it will have the CO2 from the byproduct of the area, which is the apple capital of the world. So that's a perfect example of a circular economy solution, is where we're actually not necessarily having to go back to that original state, like what we're talking about with glass containers, but we go into a new state that is actually still what we do today, right? We still carbonate Pepsi with food grade CO2. The source of it has just been kind of hidden from us in many ways. Now I'm able to build that source and literally kind of fizz it up.
You kind of talked a little bit about your company, and we'll get into a greater detail on that in a minute. Just to understand your perspective on things, the circular economy is pretty vast, and there's lots of different pieces to it. It's pretty separated right now. What is your take on the circular economy? What's your view of it from where you're operating? What are you seeing?
I think a lot of people view the circular economy as going from the starting point back to the end point and starting again. So like an example is when we talk about plastics, right? Everybody wants to bring plastics back to its original state. So you turn, PET back into rPET, and now you have rPET that can go around. Well, in theory, that makes sense, right? That is a beautiful storyline, but the reality is you're not including the label, you're not including the cap, and you're not including the goods on the inside, right? So it's only a partial circular story. And I think that's really kind of fundamentally the problem that we see across all circular economy stories today, is they're only solving part of the problem. And so from my perspective, and I could be ignorantly naive or purposely naive, whatever you want to call me, is I see that we don't need to actually put items back into their original state. We just need to find a new state where they extract the most value. And I think a lot of people are trying to always do these full circles when it's really much more complicated than that, right? It's more nuanced. An example is I'm turning apple waste. I'm not turning it back into apples, but I'm turning it into things like food grade CO2, hydrogen, carbon ash, which then could be used for EV battery making, carbon credits, and a variety of other kind of goods, both data, kind of physical and digital goods, right? It's creating a circular economy using kind of a destination for every byproduct. And that is how I like to look at it versus trying to be one point to one point. It's really one to many, and really scaling the value that you can from that single input.
That there's a lot of discussion out there, and you certainly in some of your articles and things that you're working on, and this kind of sets the stage for talking about Godot, and that is kind of elaborate on the waste to value kind of concept that you just kind of spoke to a little bit more,
Yeah. What we do at Godot is we're trying to build large scale solutions for turning waste into value. We want to build modular and composable solutions where we can design the outputs for what is going to be local demand. Fundamentally, I realized the way for the circular economy to work is to reduce transportation costs. That seems to be the highest variable in the process. So when we talk about recycling plastics, for example, the reason why I kept on running into math problems was that the cost of cleaning, sorting, and collecting was always greater than the economies of scale benefits. So even if you built the world's largest facility, the cost to bring enough materials to that facility and then handle the mass loss and all of the byproducts would make it too expensive. And more importantly, it would actually be, because of our infrastructure of fossil fuel powered vehicles, right? Our semis, it would also be a huge carbon, like the carbon footprint would be larger on the scope 3 than it would be on any benefit gained.
Wow.
And so I really see kind of Godot's role is saying, hey, these things are complicated. Let's try to find a way to turn it into value without necessarily always trying to go to its original state. Because the original state might actually be adding complications and inefficiencies that are sometimes obvious or sometimes obfuscated because they are other people's responsibility. For example, the carbon footprint generated by transportation.
As I look at it, one of the biggest inhibitors to the circular economy is actually transportation costs. Because, and so that dovetails right into what you were just kind of alluding to, is kind of a significant impact, but done locally. And I think that's also a significant concept that probably is often overlooked. The last point you made, and once in a while I'm taking notes over here, so if I turn, I'm taking notes, but the situational aspect of it, akin to situational leadership, the fact that there are some products that it makes sense to go back to the original state. There are also some products that it makes no sense going back for all of the reasons you've alluded to and that have been discussed. That to me is really, really, really interesting. I think you've described what prompted you to start the business with your legacy and what you intend to do. What are you enjoying most about it right now? And why don't you tell people a little bit in more detail about Godot and how significant the impact you're going to make and what an inspiring vision it is.
The big vision of Godot is essentially we want to be on site and near site to large waste producers and say, you have this giant pile that right now is an operational headache. It is a financial cost. It is a reputational cost. It is risk, right? There is a huge variety of problems with emissions and waste streams that no matter what company you are, you have to deal with. And so what I started to realize was if I can solve this giant pain point for these companies at their location, I'm more likely going to have an endless supply of feedstocks where now I have enough volumes that each of the byproducts are at a volume of a kind of volume that is sellable, right? Like you can't sell a pile of ash that's this big, but you can sell truckloads of ash that will be used for battery making, right? Like the volume matters. And so I think what I kind of came into this world was just through pure ignorance and asking questions, right? The whole genesis of me entering the energy space actually was from presenting at a conference 2 years ago. I was presenting on what was the data set to automate the global supply chain, and it piqued the interest of an oil exec. And when he asked to sit down at breakfast with me, I decided to take the perfect opportunity to make fun of him and said, why don't you recycle plastic? Because plastic, Pepsi and Coke just can't buy enough rPET. And so that's when I learned about the feedstock problem and stuff like that. And what really got me kind of continually digging deeper is that I actually have just a natural curiosity to learn more. And I'm willing to admit what I know and what I don't know. And so I just kept on asking questions, and I brought in people who were dealing with these problems at the scale that I like to think of things. Kind of growing up as a Pepsi bottler, I always thought on a level of PepsiCo scale. And then we're like this small piece that is able to operate locally. Well, that model is why I always think so big of like, okay, if I can do it here, I need to be able to copy and paste it, scale it. And so having this conversation with this oil exec made me realize that the biggest copy and paste thing that I could do was understand that my beverage distribution system is going out full and coming back empty. So therefore I had a full truck to play with. What I didn't realize in this process was that there are some companies that are producing so much waste today on an everyday basis that whole solution of leveraging the backhaul capacity of beverage trucks is not needed today. It is actually a future problem to be solved. And I can focus specifically at large waste producers who are essentially going, this is such a big problem. How do I solve it? I need somebody who can put these pieces together that are complicated. It's about coordinating a lot of stakeholders, aligning their perspective, objectives, and incentives, and really being able to build a system design to get it going. And so for me, kind of what I love about all of this and why it's like I've kind of jumped head deep into it and I've been more rejuvenated than I've ever been in my life is because I'm always learning, and I'm always learning the most interesting things in the world. From recycling to active inference to different things in AI, it is just a world of new things to learn. So you're never getting bored from redundancy and bored like the same thing over and over again.
Well, you know, it's evident that you have a tremendous passion for this. It's also evident that there's about 10 threads in that statement I could pull on. So I'm gonna kind of take it just a little bit different, you know, because part of circular strategies and part of the vision is also about the kind of company you're trying to build. And I'm curious, what values are important to you to think about the kind of business you're building? What values do you bring into that business? because I definitely want to pull on the AI thread. I don't even know what that other thing is you mentioned. So I'm
Yeah.
very interested in, but I do think it's important because, this emerging people, planet, profit kind of dynamic is evolving in the marketplace, obviously the triple bottom line. And I'm wondering how you're intersecting with all of that in this circular economy as well.
When you deal with problems at scale, you have to deal with completely different issues than when you're dealing in vacuums and small pilots. And so, since I've always kind of looked at large problems at scale, one of the biggest threads that I realized is we are just humans with tools to do things. It's simple. Like, let's break it down to the most
First
basics.
principle. First
Yeah,
principle.
it's first principles. We're gonna most basics. What is a company? A company is an algorithm of human capital to deliver revenue. Period. Right? So now we know, okay, how do we organize the most efficient algorithm so that when we add each additional unit, which is a human, we can do more and more revenue generation. So part of the way that I look at things is how do I essentially create a mass production of human capital so that I can build the biggest company, and then with the biggest company, share ideas and knowledge. And I started to realize over and over again, you just end up getting back to the same point of who are the people you're talking to? What are they incentivized to do? And what do they have capacity to do? And this kind of goes back. You can see that this is just something super ingrained in me, is just thinking about how do I motivate other people to do things, because I have always been in environments where I realize that individually I can't accomplish them. And in fact, today we live in a world where nobody individually can accomplish anything. Even if you think about all of these solo entrepreneurs and stuff like that, where they have teams of people, advisors,
Networks.
technologies. Yeah, like the ability to use, back in the day, Facebook to advertise to customers and getting things going, or Instagram or TikTok. Those were social media platforms that were tools that enabled people to have a wider breadth of influence. But at the end of the day, they still needed other people to work with them to produce a physical output. In your case, it's recycled metals. In my case, it's going to be a huge variety of things from hydrogen to carbon credits. But we just need other people. And now, how do I work with those other people so that I can get them onto my level? And part of getting them onto my level is making them aligned for our objectives. And our objectives are not a single point in time, but over a much longer time period. So when you think holistically about how do we address climate change, you have to start to position everybody who's working on that supply chain to start to have a much longer view vision. And that longer view vision requires essentially creating a carrot down the line. And then you realize that if you do the carrot too far down the line, it's too abstract and people can't kind of wrap their head around it. So you need an immediate carrot. Well, that tends to be like bonuses and stuff like that. And so I really started to think about how does the human experience in a work environment better accelerate our objectives from a company perspective? And how can I put them in best position to succeed? So that's kind of one of the big cruxes, is really about human-centered design and enabling them to have the best model to succeed. How do we incentivize them for the short term, medium term, and long term? And then make sure that everybody that they're working with has also those same objectives and incentives.
You've talked a little bit about all the things that anecdotally about what Godot is going to do. I wonder, what is the impact of what this vision for Godot is going to make? What do you see it achieving?
The impact is going to be dramatic in multiple levels. And, obviously I can say that as the founder looking to to, bring a sledgehammer to competitors, right? But I from an environmental standpoint, what we're talking about is essentially 43,000 tons of landfill avoidance a year. Another way of saying that is we're creating 43,000 carbon credits. So for all of these data centers, they need carbon credits. So the impact is essentially more ability to generate AI in some cases, if you're that stakeholder and that's your focus. If you're a focus of somebody who is looking for the environmental impact, you can say, hey, we're effectively removing 20% of the total vehicles in the Wenatchee Valley from the road because of the emission reductions from our landfill avoidance. The impact is going to be significant, and it's going to be localized. The other piece is quite simple. Because I am using my founder's equity to reinvest into the employees, the company, and the community, it also means that we are going to be able to have higher compensation for employees, which means those employees then have higher spending power and higher influence in their communities. Our company will be built to have much more focus on the long term. So therefore, all of a sudden, we can build much longer vision strategies with our stakeholders who will be our local community. At the end of the day, waste is always local. You don't generate waste and it appears across the world. It literally has to be produced locally and then transported. And that's where a lot of our current business models are failing, is they're just shipping the problem versus addressing the problem.
Yeah, I agree with you. You've mentioned carbon credits. You've mentioned our artificial intelligence. What are you learning about that, and what do you find interesting through your curiosity about those two things?
We are at the beginning of an AI revolution. We know these tools are powerful. We do not know the full extent of the value we can derive from them. That is, if anybody tells you AGI is around the corner, laugh at them and walk around the corner. We're not remotely close there. I would say we're actually probably closer to much like the tech bubble in 2001, where a lot of the companies collapsed, but the talent was developed and was able to be kind of the bedrock of, let's say, the internet boom. I think that we are right at that stage. I think there's a lot of companies that have generated products with a problem they're trying to find. But I really think that where this is going to solve a lot of our problems is going to be able to do the large calculations that none of us can do independently. We are just unable to process this, and we are unable to use verification or AI or kind of different types of data sets and kind of operating procedures to measure, track, and kind of generate new outputs, right? Essentially, the big thing about AI is the output generated is, if it's deterministic, it is this will produce that. We've built technology that way. Most of AI is probabilistic. What is the probable outcome of X? And so fundamentally, when we look at trying to design a future where we are changing all sorts of inputs from fuels, from electricity, whatever it may be, we need to have a much richer understanding of all of those inputs and capabilities that humans individually just can't do. And so AI is going to be able to kind of bridge that gap and assist us to become much more powerful in what we're doing.
And how do you see it intersecting with, GODOT, circular economy? Where do you see its applications?
Like, we are looking to use AI to build an AI ops platform so that we can coordinate all of the operations and sync them with both our customers' inputs, whether it's physical or digital, and our feedstock inputs, and then our customer inputs as well. So therefore, we can really essentially bind one part of the supply chain to another. That's a very traditional use case. But where I see the biggest opportunities is actually in upskilling. Fundamentally, we need to learn a lot of new skills and we need to learn a lot of new knowledge. And one of the things that we haven't done is given employees bandwidth to learn on the job as well as grow individually. And so I think it's going to be the management tools that are out there that are going to really help drive this change, because it starts to make people think differently. And once you think differently, you then can do things differently. Most business processes today are about no bandwidth, and you do the same thing you did yesterday, and hopefully you get a little bit more margin today than you did yesterday. That is not the world of the future. We will have different toys, and we'll have to learn those toys as they get generated and get outdated as fast, kind of equally as fast.
Wow.
I also see AI being used in a variety of ways for how we want to organize our employees. Instead of having a traditional hierarchy where we're putting employees into fixed positions and fixed definitions, we want to give them a much more fluid approach. And the only way to do that is being able to understand who they are and what knowledge sets, skill sets, and location they can provide to us. And so that requires natural language processing, or NLP, as a way to categorize those skill sets and knowledge sets and those certifications and stuff like that, so that I can then almost program teams to solve problems based off of the problem and the kind of necessary skills and knowledge to solve that problem. And
Brilliant.
Like I said before, every project in the future is going to require teamwork. So how we build those teams efficiently is going to be the game changer. And we're going to use natural language processing as a way to kind of hyper efficiently organize teams, and also kind of this decision-making process in those teams.
How, shifting gears, that is absolutely impressive. How is the carbon credit market developing, and what are you observing about it?
Carbon credit market is developing in two directions. One, the demand has never been higher, and the environment for or the appetite for carbon credits has never been stronger. But on the other side is the data confidence and the quality of the carbon credits being generated today is very low. And so from that standpoint, we have to find a way to marry the two. And so that's where we want to use firsthand data sets from the machines to generate the carbon credits, so that we can create auditable and verifiable carbon credits. Because down the line, you're going to need to know what machine produced what outcome, so that machine is able to kind of essentially share its history and its, let's say, landfill avoidance or whatever carbon credit or offset it's generating. So I think the biggest piece for carbon credits, as we look at that market, it's going to grow significantly. I forget the exact number. I think it's 1.6 trillion is the estimated size of the carbon credit market by the end of this decade. And that is such a large number because of the fact that for data centers to go online, for businesses whose business model is inherently producing externalities from emissions and pollution, their ability to operate in areas like California or Washington or Europe is going to be a lot more difficult. And I actually think in areas in Asia, it's actually going to have a greater impact, because countries like China can dictate it very rapidly, and American companies are not going to be able to kind of handle that speed of operation or speed of kind of compliance and legislation.
Wow. All very fascinating. Tell me about a challenge. This vision is so impressive. The impact you intend to make, the vision for your team, all very powerful statements. What's something that's challenging you right now that you're particularly focused on?
I think the biggest challenge for anything revolving change and innovation tends to be that when you look at organizations, the leaders, with exception of Bob Alvarez, obviously, tend to be tech laggards, right? There is a level of risk or perceived risk associated with new technology. And what's funny is we're at a crux where your inability to pivot is going to be your destruction, right? We are watching tons of Kodak moments happening, especially in American manufacturing, where these businesses have so much technical debt that for them to compete in a modern market, the costs are out of this world, right? From a reporting and compliance side to a software and communication side, there's just too much of a hurdle for these organizations to even make that first step, right? They're used to spending $20,000 on IT, and now they're being asked to spend $150,000, and they can't wrap their head around that. So I think that's the biggest hindrance is really decision makers. Companies are not going to take risks because they perceive any technology leap or something like that is going to be a risk, when in reality their lack of change is the risk.
I read something recently, Andy, that said chasing big ideas, bold ideas, is actually the safer path. That's your point, right? It truly is, because things are evolving so quickly that if you're not adapting on principle, and what I heard from you today is you're adapting on things and that means you're not chasing the next thing. And that can create chaos. So you got this paradox where you have to be bold, you have to change, but on the other hand, you got to be kind of zeroed in on your bet. You can't take on every bet is the point, right?
Absolutely. And I think a big piece in that is understanding you will fail.
No question.
Enjoy the failure, right? Our failures are our learnings for pivots, and pivots are not bad, right? I literally went from putting toilet paper on Pepsi trucks to now thinking about how do I take this entire piece of apple and convert it to hydrogen. Nobody would see that as a linear path. But the only way I got there was asking more and more questions on space in spaces that I did not know, and being willing to learn. And we have a lead investor. We have a valuation right now of basically 100 million post-money valuation. These are things that would not have been possible if I stuck to my original model of doing unsexy stuff. And I'm still doing unsexy stuff. Let's be honest, right? I see there's nothing really sexy about taking a pile of waste and extracting value from it. But because of that, I realized there's very little competition because the big players are either asleep at the wheel or don't have the internal governance model to enact change.
Well, it might be the new sexy. Okay. So what's been most surprising about this journey so far to you?
I think that what's been most surprising is really been the willingness of everybody to help and support me. I don't come from the energy background. I don't come from the waste background, but I've just blindly reached out to people through LinkedIn, through whatever, and be like, hey, you know this stuff. You want to give me some feedback? And then working with them, and then they become advisors and support. And the community that I've developed has really been the most surprising, is because when I felt super alone coming up with these ideas in a vacuum and then being told by everybody to protect these ideas as if somebody else is going to come in and copy them, it's super lonely. But now that I'm totally willing to share these ideas because I understand that there is no way that I individually can do all these pieces. But what I can do is talk to the right people who might be able to build those pieces either individually or with me or help me build them. Like, that's been the biggest thing, is really finding this incredible community of people with the expertise and knowledge and know-how who were like, yeah, we were on this moment to actually take this opportunity, but because of our internal processes, like, it wasn't worth my risk because I was going to be retiring in a year, whatever it may be. There's always an excuse of why things don't work. And I guess I'm young enough that they're willing to share their knowledge and be super open. And it's been an incredible opportunity. And I just can't thank that community and that network for being so receptive and open.
One of the things that our conversations around circular strategies keeps revealing, and I love your interpretation of this, but we keep hearing a lot more about collaboration and a little bit different view on competing. You compete where you need to, but the collaboration, and it seems like that's what's been surprising to you, the amount of willingness to collaborate, to share.
Yeah, I would say the surprising thing is the willingness to collaborate from individuals, not necessarily companies.
Fair enough.
Because companies are still structured as walled gardens. Mm-hmm. And so therefore you can still have walled gardens that touch each other, but they don't open the doors to each other.
Right.
And then that's the really difficult part in any type of big project in general, is the more stakeholders you have, the more incentive and objectives that you're having to incorporate into that solution set.
Yeah, no doubt. You need doors.
You need doors, and you need, and you really do need to build in an alignment and incentive and objective.
Yeah.
It is not just saying, hey, you think this is a good idea. I think this is a good idea. Let's get this going. It really has to be like delivering dollars to you as a company or to you as individuals to get on board. We're incentive driven.
Phenomenal. Last question for you. If you were to look in your circular crystal ball, what do you see coming? What do you think it means? And if you had a magic wand, what would be the first thing you'd do?
Let's do a 20 years down the line. Okay. I see a no human touch supply chain from waste to from raw to waste and back into reuse, and enabling us to kind of have a lot of our processes for food production and beverage production and commodities and all of that being able to be automated, because all of a sudden we have systems that are openly talking to each other using APIs, etc. I see an environment that allows us to no longer play this game of what I like to call it's like everybody's going to the lowest wage providers, and it's a wage arbitrage, right? I think wage arbitrage down the line is going to end, because fundamentally we're going to need to develop the reason fundamentally the reason why certain countries aren't developing is because the population is not, the middle class is not growing fast enough. And so therefore they don't have the purchasing power locally. So over time, I see a much more equalized world, and that equalized world starts with compensation that is more about what kind of ways to maximize the output of that human contribution rather than minimize the cost of that human contribution. Does that make sense?
It makes all the sense in the world. So with that vision, kind of equalized wages, and certainly you've displaced some of those people in your vision with the automation, but you're going to need the talent to maintain that automation. What would be the first thing with your magic wand you'd make happen?
The first thing with my magic wand that I'd make happen, I would actually work with the farmers and the agriculture industries of the world that are producing just massive amounts of waste that is turning into methane, and be on site. Like, I want to be on site of all of these production facilities and converting their waste streams immediately into value. That's my magic wand, is how do I build hungry hippos and deploy them all over the world?
Well, Andy, I really appreciate this wonderful and great conversation. You're on to something significant, and we wish you the very best of luck.
Thank you, Bob. And right now, I'm all in concept stage, right? You are actually doing the hard work of turning metal back into metal. And it sounds easy, but it's hot, right? It requires a lot of energy. It requires a lot of coordination. And as you said, like, the cost of transportation makes it exponentially more expensive as it goes further out.
Yeah, we're doing plastic, wood, cardboard, textiles. I mean, and looking for circular, by your definition, options for those type of products, not raw back to raw, but raw to higher value and better value. We're doing the same thing in a lot of areas. And, the challenges, that would make our flywheels very, very similar. The new challenges create new opportunities.
Another aspect is we tend to deploy human resources to problems, right?
Right.
So you are trying, if you take one product and try to create one output out of it, you now only have kind of one operation person and one salesperson. But the reality is, for you to maximize the value, is you take one input and have many outputs. So now you have a much larger sales force that is necessary relative to your operations force.
No question about it.
And I think those structural pieces are where we're really excited to take the lead on. But I think what you are doing today is actually making a great impact. And don't undervalue the work of being that integral part of the circular economy. I just think of you guys as phase one, and we're phase two.
Awesome. Great conversation. Thank you so much.